Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to today's Public Subsidy Board. I am New York State Department of Labor Commissioner and Board Chair Roberta Reardon. I want to say thank you to my fellow board members for joining me today. Quorum has been established. For those joining us remotely through Zoom, you have been muted upon entry and will remain so throughout today's meeting. There will be no public testimony during this meeting. Any distracting video will be disabled. Members are joining this meeting from two physical locations in both Albany and New York City. This is an open public meeting in compliance with the Open Meetings Law, and it is being recorded. The recordings are available on the Department of Labor's website. As a reminder, if any board member has written material to submit for review or consideration, they must be submitted at least 24 hours in advance. I'd like to give all of my fellow board members the opportunity to introduce themselves. Let's start with the members who are here with me in Albany. I'll start with Al Catalano.
Good morning, Al Catalano, Executive Director of the New York State Building and Construction Trades Council.
Good morning, Dan McGraw with the New York State Conference of Operating Engineers.
Chris Lund, public member.
Laura Regan, Vice President, Eastern Contractors Association.
Joe Hogan, Vice President, Associated General Contractors of New York State.
Sean McCready, Director of Public Work and Secretary to the Board.
Laura Campion, Deputy General Counsel and Associate Commissioner.
Thank you. And now we'll go to New York City. I'll start with Jim Whalen.
Jim Whalen, President of the Real Estate Board of New York.
Peter Flory, President, New York State Builders Association.
Hope Knight, President, CEO, Empire State Development.
Lara Skinner, Faculty, New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations.
Gabriella Barber with the New York State and New York City Building Trades Council.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm so glad you could all join us today. We're also joined by, of course, Board Secretary Sean McCready and members of the Department's Counsel's Office who are here to provide guidance or consultation if we need a legal perspective at any point during this meeting. Turning to our agenda, I will now ask Sean to provide us with an update on board activities.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, members of the board. The Bureau is excited to be overseeing the launch of the new contractor registry system up in the state of New York. Under this new law, which goes into effect in a few weeks on December 30th, contractors who plan to solicit work on covered projects must register with the Department of Labor. For the board's purposes, please note that covered projects include those construction jobs subject to Labor Law 224A. The purpose of the law is to ensure accountability while protecting workers. Contractors will be asked to provide proof of workers' compensation and unemployment insurance coverage in order to register, and companies that currently are debarred will not be permitted to register. The Bureau has worked with our communications office, council, and IT unit to get the system up and running ahead of time to avoid delays that otherwise could affect the contractor's ability to get on work. Next year, the system will be publicly searchable so that agencies and the general public can view registrants' basic information. And I want to assure you that the confidential information will remain confidential and hidden from public view. I'd be interested to hear any feedback from board members that you received regarding the new setup. And thank you. Commissioner, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. The next item on the agenda is the adoption of the minutes from the September 25th board meeting. The minutes were provided to you ahead of this meeting, and a draft is posted online as well. I move we approve these minutes for the official record. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, please raise your hands. Any opposed? Not voting? Thank you. It's carried unanimously. The next item on our agenda is to continue our discussion on the public hearing topic of calculating tax savings. As a reminder to where we are in this process, at our September 25th meeting, we've decided to take more time to review and digest materials presented. And then we received additional written material from Anthony Tufariello, which was sent to the board for review. During the last meeting, the board came to the consensus that it would be most beneficial to hear directly from the experts who submitted written testimony so we could have a dialogue and allow board members to ask any follow-up questions for clarification. Subsequently, the board had the opportunity to suggest additional experts. None were identified. Due to a lack of suggestions and with the consent of the board members, I sent invites to the 8 people who responded to the original request for written testimony. 3 of the invitees responded to testify and are joining us today virtually to discuss their written testimony and to take questions from the board members. Their written testimony is available on the department's website and was provided to the board for review prior to this meeting. As a reminder, the hearing is still open. Today, We must consider the new information along with all of the information we have provided since the hearing was opened on May 20th. The goal of this hearing is to develop recommendations on the topics of calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. Sean, can you please remind the board about our process?
Certainly. The board members may propose recommendations for consideration. I, as board secretary, will distill the recommendations in writing and provide them to the board for review and consideration at a future meeting. Per the board's procedures, it is upon the close of the hearing that the secretary shall reduce the recommendation to writing and distribute to the board for review within 7 days. A public meeting will then be scheduled within 3 weeks of the close of the hearing for the board to vote on adopting any recommendation as filed for submission to the commissioner for consideration. Assuming that the recommendation is adopted by Commissioner Reardon, the Department of Labor will then have to engage in voting. Commissioner, back to you.
Thanks, Sean. Does anyone on the board have any questions about the process? Okay. Now, we'll move on to the in-person testimony portion of the agenda. We have 3 experts who have been invited to testify on this topic. I have read through all of the information provided to the board since May. It has been detailed and voluminous, and I appreciate the time and effort everyone has spent to ensure that the board is well informed on the subtopics surrounding calculating tax savings. Today, we'll focus on the board being able to ask follow-up questions to the information provided. This is the board's opportunity to probe into the subtopic areas with these experts. The goal for today is to gather enough information to get all of us closer to making a recommendation on calculating tax savings. We ask that the experts keep to 7 minutes or less to be fair to those who had the same parameters during our public hearing in May. We will provide verbal time cues if needed to keep us on track. The first will be when you have 30 seconds left, and a second alerting that your time has run out. At that time, I ask you to conclude so that members of this body have the chance to ask questions. Our first speaker joining us virtually is Dr. Alexander Heil, practicing economist and adjunct faculty at Columbia University and New York University. Alexander, please begin.
Yes, hi. Good morning, everyone. I submitted testimony to the board, and I don't have any additional written testimony or any testimony that I'd like to share at this point. I'm happy to take questions. I can just briefly summarize, to refresh anybody's memory on what I said in my testimony. Essentially, I try to raise what is primarily a methodological point, which is any analysis that captures current and future payments or benefits or subsidies or any kind of financial flows should be undergoing a rigorous discounted cash flow analysis, essentially. So in other words, the discounting of future benefits and future costs is essential in order to take account of time value of money, the opportunity cost of money through time. And that is true for investment projects in the public sector. And that's certainly also true when it comes to more financial questions. I don't think that from an economic analysis point of view, the discounting is necessarily debated. I think the question that is probably up to some discretion is the choice of a discount rate. So the discount rate is the interest rate applied to any kind of future payment or benefit or subsidy to bring it back to the present point in time. And there's an equity consideration that comes along with that. So in other words, if one discounts too heavily future payments, they tend to diminish compared to the present. If you discount not enough, then future payments may be overrepresented compared to what the present period financial flows might have been. So then that leads to the question of what's an appropriate discount rate for any kind of long-term public infrastructure, in particular project that has a social benefit component to it. I think there's the consensus in the economic literature has sort of evolved around anywhere around 2-3% is probably, in real terms, inflation adjusted, is probably appropriate. In comparison, the private sector uses a market-driven discount factor that is essentially the weighted average cost of capital, which is a blend, depending on the financing structure of an organization, between equity and debt financing. And in terms of, for financial cash flows from a state budget point of view, it might be appropriate to, especially for the longer term time horizons, to use something that comes pretty close to a state long-term borrowing rate in real terms that then represents a discount rate for analysis. So that's essentially what I said. So I'm open for discussion and questions at this point.
Thank you. So does anyone on the board have any questions for Alexander? Yes.
I
Jeff.
do.
Professor, thank you very much. For my purposes, for this hearing, my primary question is not just to you, but to all, it's going to be the mechanics of it. In other words, if a discount rate is going to be set, or either a firm number or regionalized, or a ceiling and a floor, what are the actual mechanics? What are the factors that go into calculating that rate? What things out in the world, whether the prime or whatever it may be, what goes into making that calculation?
Yeah, I think there's sort of I think in this particular case, one can be very specific, and I think what is probably appropriate is to use the state's long-term borrowing rate. So what it uses on its debt instruments, what essentially it is a market-driven interest rate that can be used at that point for the calculation of a present value in a discounted cash flow analysis. Essentially, I think there's certainly a lot of economic theory in terms of preference of consumption and income in the present versus the future, but I think for practical purposes, I think it would be the most relevant to go with an actual borrowing rate in my take.
Did I hear someone in New York with a question?
Yep.
Okay.
I had a similar question. So your recommendation in terms of what indice to use would be the New York State long-term borrowing rate. Now, would that be the pure rate, or would there be a margin attached to that? Is your experience just using that rate, and how often does that fluctuate?
Well, the rate fluctuates, I mean, basically with market conditions and whenever the state goes to market sense. So the discount rate, and that's a good point, sort of reflects some of the underlying risks as well. But I think for calculation of a discount rate, one could assume that you can establish some sort of a discount factor in order to make it applicable and practical. That is essentially some sort of an average or a product of the last few, let's say transactions or the long-term trends. I think it's just important that the analysis time frame is somewhat consistent with the time frame of this financial instrument that we're considering, because longer there's a premium for long-term borrowing, certainly just from a liquidity point of view. So as long as that's aligned, I would think though that is reasonable. And there shouldn't be too much fluctuation, hopefully, in any kind of recent rates that have been determined.
So this would be used with various industrial development agencies across the entire state of New York. Do you believe, in your experience, that there may be a regional fluctuation in what the discount rate might be, depending on what region you might be in, or do you think that should be fairly consistent?
Well, there might be certainly for different agencies, they have different borrowing rates. I think maybe it would make sense to, and I have a strong opinion about this in general, but yes, variations do exist, and it might make sense to just think about a rate that applies to essentially across the state. So
thank you very much.
That would have to be determined in some way or another.
Thank you.
Al?
I guess my question really goes to what I guess is the premise, is that we're assuming that we want to discount future value of
Mhm.
subsidy. And is that already determined? Has the board determined that we want to discount that?
I think that's all on the table.
So then my question would be, to Dr. Howard, is that the assumption, or I guess predicating your discussion on this, on your testimony?
Well, what I tried to make the point was if one deals with multi-period analyses, meaning multiple years, then discounting is the typical way that an economic analysis would account for those differences in time horizon. So in other words, a payment that is projected for 10 years out would have to be discounted to the present period in order to make it comparable to something that occurs in the present moment. And that seems fairly standard in sort of certainly the economic practice.
Any questions in New York? Oh, yes. I see.
Yes.
Mylan.
Thank you, Commissioner. Doctor, thanks for your time today and thanks for participating in this process. I just have a few quick questions for you.
Sure.
Are you aware of any examples where a project or a public entity values long-term income streams on a gross basis rather than on a net present value basis?
I can't think of any examples. I also have to, qualify that I haven't researched this, but discounting is in most cases, I would think, a way that analyses are conducted. But I can't speak to the entire portfolio of analyses that are done.
Got it. Thank you.
Everywhere.
The next question is a yes/no question. Is the value of $1 20 years from now the same as the value of $1 today?
No.
Okay, thank you. Last question. If I pick up a standard economics textbook from the library, what would it tell me about how to calculate the future value of money?
The future value, or how do you treat the future cash flows?
At the latter.
It would suggest that you engage in a discounting type analysis in order to develop a present value from future payments.
Doctor, thanks again for your time and participation in the process.
Does anybody else have any questions for Alexander? Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, for making yourself available today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to ask Ryan Silva to join us, Executive Director of the New York State Economic Development Council. Ryan, when you're ready.
Good morning. Thank you, Commissioners Reardon and Knight, members of the Public Subsidy Board. Similar to Dr. Hale from NYU, I don't have a lot to add to my written testimony, which was submitted back in September, but can provide sort of a summary of the testimony that was submitted based upon the questions that were asked, when and how to use present discounted value, the average annual increase in property taxes, then how to calculate the value. And then there were some specific questions about what conditions must be met and maintained to satisfy pilot agreements, under what circumstances are pilot agreements rescinded, and then certainly are there land value tax jurisdictions. So, prior to any abatement, IDAs are required by state law, general municipal law, to submit a benefit cost analysis. They evaluate these projects. There are a variety of different tools out there that are utilized. Some have, IDAs have their own in-house cost benefit analysis tools. Others contract with third-party entities, nationally recognized economic development consulting firms. There are factors to be taken into consideration when and how to use net present discounted value. I believe at one point New York City was referenced. They have a very unique model that works for the New York City economy, and they've been utilizing that for several years. Geography, cost of capital, local tax rate, and other factors certainly vary from one region to another, and in many circumstances even vary from one municipality within a geographic region to another. So given the wide range of factors, we would defer to the models that are utilized by our local IDAs across the state on how they calculate net present value, and it certainly varies from project to project. The average annual increase in property taxes for New York City versus New York State, I mean, we're all sort of aware of the 2% tax cap that exists. Again, that varies from one part of the state to the other. Some areas, they will exceed the 2% cap and they have a process that they have to follow if they want to do that at the local level. And that, generally speaking, varies again from one part of the state to the other. The value of tax savings from pilot program, at the time an IDA reviews a project for a potential abatement, construction has not been begun. So they're sort of working off of an estimate of what the future value is going to be and what the future assessment is going to be after the project is completed. The local assessor usually comes in and provides a final assessment. And that's when you can sort of really identify what the benefit is going to be worth over a particular period of time. And then the specific questions that were asked, what conditions must be met and maintained to satisfy a pilot agreement. Each project that receives IDA support is required to have a signed agreement where the project applicant agrees to certain criteria. It's including but not limited to capital expenditure, cost of the project, jobs created, jobs retained. If it's a renewable energy project, how much renewable energy is going to be generated. If it's a project that has a residential component, how many housing units are actually going to be created. Several IDAs have local labor policies that they have pay equity policies and/or paid or unpaid real property tax policies as well. They vary from project to project and region to region. Pilot agreements can be rescinded. Every IDA is now required by law to have a clawback policy. Any failure to comply with any of the terms agreed to in the contract may result in termination of a pilot and/or recapture of already received benefits. IDAs work closely with project applicants to accurately ascertain. They have to go by New York State 45s. There's a variety of different tools they utilize annually to evaluate whether a project has met the not recommendations, but requirements within the signed agreement. And there are numerous examples in my testimony. I just listed a few out there where we know pilot agreements have been rescinded or recaptured. And as far as land tax value jurisdictions, property taxes usually contain two assessment components, a land value and improvements. The pilot payments impact the increase to the improvements component of the assessment. No abatement is given to the land value or the various special districts tax included in communities. So with that, I stayed under my 7 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions from any members of the board.
Thank you. Gary.
Oh, thank you. And again, thank you for testifying today. Just a couple of questions in terms of the New York State Economic Development. Would you agree from the prior testimony and also from possibly other testimony you've read, would you agree that there are a number of variables that can impact the determination of the net present value versus, future value? Would you agree that there are a number of variables this is actually a very complicated issue?
And this, Mr. LaBarbera, I think I just have a hard time saying yes. I would agree with that. Absolutely. It is a very complicated issue, and I would be remiss if I didn't say the gentleman speaking before me and the gentleman speaking after me are probably much more attuned to answer some of those more difficult technical questions than I am.
Right, but so let me ask you this again, as representing New York State EDC. I mean, would you agree that a more uniform approach to determining the value of subsidy would be helpful in this process?
I would say that having a range and understanding that there are regional economic differences and the access to the cost of capital really does vary over a particular period of time, and that setting sort of a standard statewide rate may be applicable in certain geographies and may not be as applicable in other geographic areas. For example, I think New York City uses 6%. That, I mean, the people in New York City know far more than I do about the New York City economy and what the value is. The folks on the ground on Long Island and in the North Country, the value can range quite a bit. So any sort of like hard and fast number may not necessarily be applicable in other parts of the state as it would be in others.
Okay, and I just, last question, last point, again, because it's important what EDC feels, and I know I'm just talking to him, so again, we would agree that there are a number of variables that could impact how this calculation is made, and that a more uniform approach where something is more easily calculated would probably be in everyone's best interest, right?
I think that depends. You know, again, our perspective is every IDA, you know, evaluates projects a little bit differently based upon what the project plans to return on investment. So a discounted rate, you know, certainly takes into the consideration what the actual value at the time is when it comes to borrowing and lending and making the project financially feasible. So we know many of our members utilize net discounted rate. I think ultimately I would defer to the expertise of the board because that is what the board in essence was formulated for. And I'm certainly not a member of the subsidy board. My opinion is that the net present value accurately reflects what the value of an abatement over a period of time is, more accurately than further down the line 15 to 20 years from now, or 12 years, depending on the duration of the pilot.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. LaBarbera.
Laura?
No, it was Hope.
It's me.
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's wrong woman at the end of the table.
Ryan, just to double click on something you just said, I want to just ask, is it that you've seen most IDAs use net present value methodology to value benefits?
Commissioner Knight, yes. Many, if not, I don't want to say all because I don't have the exact number, but many of the industrial development agencies, as far as I am aware of, utilize a net present value for calculating the benefit of a project, an abatement.
Thank you.
Anybody in Albany? Mr. Whalen?
Thank you, Commissioner. Ryan, thanks for your time today and thanks for all the work you put into this. 2 questions. Are you aware of any examples where a project or a public entity values long-term income streams on a gross basis rather than on a net present value basis?
Mr. Whalen, I am not aware of any particularly off the top of my head.
Thanks. Yes or no question. Is the value of $1 20 years from now the same as the value of $1 today?
I am certainly not an economics major, but I'm quite confident that $1 today probably isn't going to be worth the same amount 15 to 20 years from now. I wish.
Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I have a couple of questions for you. And I probably asked this from Michael as well. First, if the board decides to defer to the savings calculations that are done by the various IDAs throughout the state, what guardrails exist to prevent an IDA from undervaluing the savings to help a project avoid the coverage under 224A?
That is a good question that I would probably defer to Michael, who will be testifying after me. I don't know of what those guardrails might be offhand. I don't.
And what problems could arise if we leave the determination of the discount rate of percentage of savings over time in pilot agreements to IDAs to set for the board's purposes? How might this affect development?
I think if it's valued too high or too low, depending upon, what the board ultimately decides, it could, lead to less projects moving forward and being financially viable. It could lead to them having to delay and reevaluate the financial capital stack that they put together in order to make a project financially feasible. So there's a lot of different outcomes that could potentially come from not valuing the discounted model or the discounted rate correctly.
And then the third thing is, in your opinion, what impact will using the discounted present value have? Will that be enough money to swing projects between being covered and not covered? Is that a significant difference?
Yeah, again, I think it depends, and that's where I think the board has a responsibility, right? If they feel that a project is, not being calculated correctly, there's a model to challenge that, right? And evaluate whether or not it can be covered or not covered. I would say that if it's too high, too far in one direction or another, it could, but it would probably have to be fairly egregious, at least based on my limited knowledge, in order for it to swing a project in one direction or another.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So I'm just trying to understand, because I think this net present value argument is this whole approach is very, very difficult and to really get our arms around trying to figure out some more transparency and a more efficient way of thinking about this. Let me ask you this question. In general, with your experience, would you say the value of land will continue to increase over the next 20 years versus decrease?
I'd have to go back and look at the value of land and how it's increased or decreased over a period of time. You never know yet. You have an anomaly where you have a financial crisis or a recession. I would venture a guess as somebody who bought a house in 2007. I lost money on that home when I went to sell it in 2010. And paid a lot more than what it was actually worth. So somebody who tracks the economic value of land probably would be better suited to answer that question than I do. Probably generally speaking, my father used to always say, invest in land and invest in property. It's a good thing. So I would venture a guess that over an extended period of time, more often than not, the value of land and property probably does go up.
Yeah, and one other question. So on facilities that may be housing tenants, would you say generally over 20 years that rental incomes increase or decrease?
I'm not aware of any circumstance where rents go down offhand.
Just trying to think of things in a different way. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else in New York with a question? Mr. Whalen?
I would just note on that last hypothetical that while, most likely in every instance, the value of land and the amount of rent would go up over time, to do the analysis properly, you would have to discount the value of the land 20 years out or the rent 20 years out to do a proper analysis.
I would just say the cost to maintain, the cost overall, in general, cost of living, everything goes up. The cost of the taxes over time, the cost to maintain facilities, properties goes up over time as well. And there's a variety of different factors, interest rates, borrowing rates that impact that as well.
Well, and I think we heard from, I think it was Seth Sanders from Cornell, who said over time, those variations flatten. I mean, a lot of the tax credits are 20, 30 years in length. So there may be individual differences year to year, but over time, those differences tend to flatten. They don't go away, but they flatten. Anybody else for Ryan? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Happy holidays.
you very
You
much.
too. You too, Ryan. Thank you.
So next, we're going to have Michael Ndolo, Director of Economic Development of the MRB Group. He's also joining us virtually. Michael, when you're ready.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm going to use my time wisely here by not repeating what has already been said. I think Dr. Hale laid out the case for a discount quite well. So I'm not going to repeat that. What I'd love to jump into to help the board, I've been listening to these questions you've been asking, and I'd like the opportunity to say, what I wouldn't want you to end up with is a complicated and hard to administer system, right? That is potentially subject to a lot of subjectivity, let's call it. But I think that there is a way for us to do this in a manner that is both, theoretically good, right, in the sense of like, yes, we're going to discount it, and straightforward to administer, okay? So let me just lay that out quickly here. A lot of this is contained in my written testimony, but I'm going to change the order of it a little bit here. The first thing that we have to do is we have to figure out what the nominal value is of the pilot savings, right? And how do we do that? Well, we know what the pilot, we have some estimation of what the pilot is. Usually they float, right? So what we like to say is, figure out that estimate of the pilot, right? And all the IDAs do that right now. Sometimes it's a fixed schedule, sometimes it floats. And then you have to understand what the taxes would be if the project wouldn't move forward, right? I'm sorry, if the project moved forward, but was fully taxable. In order to do that, you do have to inflate those at about 2% out to say basically, hey, property tax in the future is going to be more than it is today, right? So we have the otherwise applicable taxes inflated at 2% and the pilot based on whatever that schedule is. The difference is the nominal amount of tax savings, right? As far as the application of the discount rate, once we've established what the discount rate is, it's the simplest possible calculation. There is no daylight between how one person does it and how another person does it, right? So that you can be assured of, there is no complexity in that calculation. It's a formula in Excel, okay? I think that the best way to picture this is that you really have four options. One is a single discount rate, and you just say, here it is, everybody use it, right? That's the easiest and simplest way to do it. It's probably not the best way in my view, and I can explain that if folks want to talk through that. You could have a range of rates, but the issue with a range of rates is that you'd have to then establish the criteria for why someone would use the high end versus the low end, right? And again, you're sort of inserting subjectivity into that. You could do it geographically, but my view is, and I've looked at this data, it's really hard to get geographically specific when you talk about discount rates, okay? So the fourth way is the way that I think makes the most sense for the board to consider, which is using implied discount rates, okay? This is based on market data right now by project type, right? An industrial project versus an office project versus a housing project, right? That we have extremely good data, very comprehensive. If you used a rate based on the type of project, then I think you take out subjectivity, right? So what I would say is, once a year, let's call it, the Public Subsidy Board issues a list of rates. Here's the rate for industrial, here's the rate for office, here's the rate for housing, etc. And those are the rates that the IDAs should use. Now, you could always have a clause in there to say, in exceptional circumstances that have to be justified in this way, you could use a different rate. But these are the rates we would expect you to use because these are the market-based implied discount rates. I actually have, if you're interested, I actually have a data sheet that I can show you that lays it out, that gives you by type a minimum rate, a maximum rate, and an average rate. I think you should use the average rate for each of those. And that gets you to a methodologically sound and easy to administer system to get to the, to get the net present value of those future benefits. I have a few other things to say, but I'm gonna cut it off there because I'd rather just take your questions and go with it in that direction.
Terrific, thank you. So I'm gonna go to Joe first.
Michael, thank you very much. This is, very interesting. And the question, you talked about a formula, you talked about a methodology and coming up with that methodology for establishing the rate, looking at the average. What goes into that methodology? What are the factors that you consider when you're, looking at, or others consider in coming up with those ranges and then eventually that average? What do they factor in?
Okay, so I have a very technical answer to that, which I'll go quickly. That's the weighted average cost of capital for an individual developer. But that's not practical for this public subsidy board, right? Because you'd have to know all kinds of things that you're not going to know, right? Which is sort of what their, equity dividend rate needs to be to attract investment. The way to get that data, and again, I'll show you this sheet in a second if folks are interested. There are different groups that take market surveys, and they basically say, okay, what is the implied discount rate that you're using for these types of deals, right? They aggregate all that data and then they average it by project type. That's the simplest way to do it. That's the way that I do it when I'm asked by a public authority or by a public agency to discount something for a private sector entity, right? I will just say earlier, the question was asked to Dr. Heil that whether or not we should use the public borrowing rate for the state plus a margin. I think that's difficult to do because it's really not a public rate and the margin would be different based on the project type. I think if you just use this survey data, you have it, right? It's right there. And again, the data that goes into that is what actual deals are clearing at today, the implied discount rate for those deals.
And then, just to follow up a little bit on that. So who provides those market surveys? Where are they generated and getting access? How often are they generated?
I can tell you the data source that I use is called realtyrates.com. realtyrates.com. They publish quarterly a survey that's called an investor survey. They have a couple of other surveys, but the one you're interested in would be the investor survey. The document I have is from Realty Rates, actually. I'll pop it up right now, if I can. Okay, here it is right here. So this is the Realty Rates survey. I grayed out some of this text. You may not be able to see it. I have provided this as a handout that I'd ask be entered into the record. But for new development right here, you can see in realtyrates.com investor survey, fourth quarter 2024. These are the implied discount rates. The average is this column here. I've circled the appropriate numbers for apartment, golf, senior housing, industrial, etc. Right? Using a data source like this, anybody can get this data. Anybody can go there. This is the one I happen to use just because I trust this one more than I trust local surveys, right? Because who knows how comprehensive those surveys are. This one is quite good, and I know it's used by a lot of folks out there. It's an extremely cheap subscription, by the way, I will say. So it's not like it's going to be costly for anybody to get, or the Public Subsidy Board could use it and simply publish those rates with permission, which I'm sure that the agency would be happy. The folks that collect this would be happy to provide.
Sam?
Yeah, just following up, realtyrates.com is what you use, but there's others that do these type of surveys. Is there a variance, a significant variance between realtyrates.com and others you have seen?
So the difference is that Realty Rates is looking at the national real estate market, And they're able to collect way more survey data than any local provider. And so just the number of survey responses are going to be way higher for them than a local provider. To answer your exact question, I don't know how to answer that because I haven't looked at any of those reports in recent years. I've been using this for as long as I've been doing it for the last 10 of the 20 years that I've been working in this field. I've been using realtyrate.coms for that reason. So unfortunately, I can't answer that question. My assumption is that there would be differential between local surveys and the national survey just based on volume.
So would you think if there was a New York City or New York centric survey versus a national survey, there would be probably a significant difference?
There could be. My concern for you would be the sample size and the reliability therein. Would you be able to get enough deals where you could feel comfortable within a reasonable margin of error that you're actually at the average discount rate, average implied discount rate?
Because I guess I'm asking in the sense that you're suggesting that we use or adopt something like this, but if the board were to do that, I mean, we'd have to be pretty confident that what we're adopting really reflects the market in New York State and New York City.
I guess that's the question for the board more than for me in that sense, is like, are we comfortable with national level data versus local data? I don't know. I literally today could not point you to a data source that is exclusively New York implied discount rates. I don't know if it exists. It may.
Anybody else for Michael?
I guess, so you mentioned 4 possibilities, right? I think it was like like a 1 discount rate, which you kind of said wouldn't be a good idea. The range of rates, one that was more geographical, and then the implied discount market. Would you say any one of them could be a possibility for the board to take up?
Oh yes, yeah, you could. The one that I'm a little bit unsure of is that geographic one. If we could even get a good sense of like how different it is, in Rockland County versus Suffolk County. I don't know if that would be really implementable from the point of view of the Public Subsidy Board. But the other ones for sure are possibilities, right? To me, it's really a question of what is optimal. Let me give you an example, right? If, for example, you use just the overall average, all projects, and you put it in there today, that means you would probably be undervaluing the public subsidy value to developers of apartments, and you'd be overvaluing the public subsidy to folks that are in riskier environments like lodging and golf courses and so on like that, right? So I think with a very small amount of variation in that, in the sense of, yes, you could use a single rate. It is no more difficult to establish multiple rates based on project type because the data is there. It doesn't complicate the calculation therein. It really doesn't complicate anything else. So yes, you could use a single rate. I'm just not sure that that is optimal for you for that reason.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Ryan. Well, a couple of things. What's the impact of using a discounted present value? How much is that going to swing a project one way or the other? What's the difference in the amount?
Yes, thank you for reposing that question because there's a pretty clear answer I can give you there. If you have a very short pilot, right, 5 years, it's barely going to make any difference, right? If you have a long pilot, it's going to make a big difference, right? If you have a 40-year pilot, like say for an affordable housing project or something like that, which actually, I'm sorry, that's a bad example because obviously that would already be subject. But, as an example, a 40-year pilot, well, that means that is going to change the number significantly, right? Because now you're discounting 40 years back to the present, right? I still think it's the methodologically sound way to do it, but it's going to have more of an influence on long dated pilots than short dated pilots.
Right, because the law wants 30% of the public funding is one of the triggers for our public works laws. So we don't want to water it down simply because it's a longer project. The work is still, the law is still trying to ensure that those wages are paid appropriately. And I guess our question is, how do we arrive at that value? What categories?
And-
Oh, go ahead.
Let me just clarify. I'm using 40 years of a pilot as an very extreme example, right? That does not, that rarely happens. A typical pilot is about 10 years. For very large industrial projects, maybe 15, right? Beyond that, it gets rarer when you get to it. Well, actually, solar projects will typically be longer duration simply because they're trying to match the duration of the pilot to their financing, right? So that's one example of a category, but that's relatively limited. I would say most pilots are 10 to 15 years.
But aren't tax credits longer?
It depends on what kind of tax credit you're talking about. If you have something like a historic rehabilitation tax credit, which I know is not subject to the Public Subsidy Board, but that's like a compliance period of 7 years, right? So, Empire State Development, Commissioner Knight is here. When they issue an Excelsior tax credit schedule, that's a 10-year, usually a 10-year schedule of tax credits. So it depends on the program you're talking about.
And actually, what categories of tax savings do you think should be included in the calculation?
Speaking from myself from a methodological point of view, I'll say any value that is not received in the present moment really should be part of this discounting, right? I can envision a situation where there might be some deferral of a benefit into the future. The Excelsior tax credits is the perfect example, right? That would be a situation where the full value of the benefit isn't realized until year 10. So you would discount the first year by 1 year, you discount the second year by 2 years, that kind of thing over the 10 years. That would also make sense to me. I guess what I'd say is there doesn't seem to be any compelling reason why you wouldn't do that, right? Because we're trying to do an apples to apples comparison across all of these potential factors that go into your calculation. A lot of the benefits, many of the benefits that are received in year 0, let's call it year 1 of the project. For example, when an IDA induces a deal, there's a sales tax exemption usually and a mortgage recording tax exemption. Well, that happens at the front end of the project. You wouldn't discount that, right? But you would discount the pilot because that's happening in the future. So the short answer is, if the benefits received in the future, I think it's appropriate to discount it, whatever that is, if it's a tax abatement or a tax credit.
Okay. Thank you.
I do want to reiterate that the the mechanics are really not at all a question. The mechanics of how one does a net present value, there is no daylight between how one person does it and another person does it. And if someone tells you that, I would like to have that discussion with them, right? Really, it's, really your only, in my view, your only question is, what is the appropriate discount rate, right? Not how do you use that discount rate. You use the discount rate based on how the formulas work for discount rates, based on the number of years between today and when the benefit's received. It's that simple.
My only comment, I guess, is like, what is appropriate? What is the appropriate wage to be paid for the workers on the job? I just want to throw that in. It's not just what is the appropriate determination of the future discount. I think that goes to the spirit of the law. Not a question.
Not a question. And lastly, I think with the geographical thing, one of the suggestions that has been floated is that you can have a pretty standard rate for the rest of the state, but New York City's real estate market is so volatile that it wouldn't, does it make sense to you to have two rates, one for New York and one for the rest of the state? And would you just say New York, or would you say, you know, in the minimum wage law, it's New York, Westchester, and Long Island are all more contiguous than the rest of the state, but what, let me hear your thinking on that.
I'm going to answer your question with a question, and I don't mean to be flip, but please tell me where downstate ends and upstate begins. Right?
Similar problem, yes.
And therein lies the rub, right? So if you were to be very clear that we as a board, we will only contemplate a differential for the 5 boroughs, then I would say, okay, then you need to find out what that differential is, right? And then that's pretty clear. But from a data point of view, it's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit harder to do that when you start chopping up geographies, and now it's harder to arrive at a discount rate that's really data supported, right? That's all.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question,
Sure.
Michael? And
Yes.
thank you for your time, and just to try to overly simplify things, because I agree with you that it's, kind of complicated, should be much more simplified. But I just want to understand this, So if a development project gets a $100 million tax subsidy, right? Essentially what you're saying that over a 20-year period, that 100 million is really not worth 100 million. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So
that is the essence
when
of
a
how.
developer calculates, and Jim may know this, if he needs 100 million, or they need $100 million of tax subsidy, but they're going to say it's discounted, would they be asking for 120 million so they get their 100 million? Or when they ask for $100 million subsidy, they know it's really not $100 million? I know, because there's still $100 million offset, right, on tax abatement.
So you bring up a perfectly valid point, and what I'll say is this: that absolutely happens. I've seen it happen in real time. A developer or an industry, right, in formulating their ask, will contemplate the timing of the incentive. If they know, and so the Excelsior tax credit program is the perfect example, right? Because I've actually seen this happen with industries where they say, hey, we only look at the first 5 years of benefit we get. Anything beyond year 6, we don't even factor in to our calculation of the benefit in New York versus other states, as an example, right? When you're doing an industry attraction project, they will heavily discount anything that's beyond, just a few years, because of the weighted average cost of capital that they're facing, right? So yes, in the example you gave, when someone's asking for $100 million, saying that the $100 million is required for the deal to move forward, they have had to make an assumption about the timing of the flow of money into their deal to make that assertion. Otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Okay, that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, I know this question wasn't asked, but there is one other wrinkle that I would like to offer to the Public Subsidy Board. And that's just simply, if you choose to move forward with, the recommendation, for example, that I'm making about having these separate rates, the one wrinkle you'll have to work out is just when they reset, right, on an annual basis. Let's say we're going to reset them every year, right? You'll just have to specify, is it the date of inducement by an IDA of the deal, or is it the date when the deal closes, right? Which is the one, is it when they submit application? So that's the only other thing that I would want you to specify in order to get perfect clarity. I think once we have that, and once we know what the discount rates are, then there's 100% clarity on all the parts about how this should happen, okay? Some of these deals might take 2 years to get induced, right? With the complicated deal for housing, for example, right? And, you know, I wouldn't want them to step into a deal, make a determination, and then it change in the future because of a rate. You would just have to say, this is the applicability of that rate on a point of time basis.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you very much. We appreciate it and happy holidays.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time to be before you. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we've heard from many experts on 2 topics of our May 20th public hearing. And today, we've had the opportunity to gather additional information on the topic of calculating tax savings and question those who provided further details and expert opinions. I thought the discussion was really good. I really appreciate everybody's input. Now I want to invite the board members to discuss what we just heard. And I will just remind us, we don't have an actual question on the floor to debate. So we're going to actually have the opportunity to discuss what we've heard overall, starting with May 20th and today. Does anybody have any observations they'd like to share?
I guess I might start, I think, and as I said before, I think the idea of including a discounted rate, net present value rate in the calculation is appropriate. And I think that the point that we struggled with in the last meeting, in large measure, was what that rate should be. I think the initial offering was to let the individual IDAs set it. I think there was a little bit of queasiness about that. And the suggestion of a statewide rate. And I think that, you know, the 2 questions I think need to wrestle with. One is to set a discount rate. I obviously believe that we should. And then the question is, what can be done in an objective manner that is not subject to the whims and vagaries of a particular IDA or any other individual is important. I like the idea of having a source, the realty.com, realtyrates.com as an objective source. And that seems to make sense to me, but I think, you know, the question then, if that's the way that we go, you know, they change quarterly. You know, do you allow it to just be whatever that rate is at a certain moment in time? Or is it set by this board on an annual basis based on that?
Did I see a hand up in New York?
I'll make some comments.
Okay.
So, thank you, Commissioner. So I think at this point, you know, today we didn't see any folks that testified other than Tony submitting further, Tony Cucurello, written testimony. We didn't, you know, I know you invited people, we spoke to some people, we didn't feel the need for additional testimony or questions. And I think if you look at all of the testimony, written and oral, I think there are very valid and strong arguments that have been made. And clearly, I think there's been a lot of expert testimony that differs from what we've heard some of today about discounts and the present value for a number of economic reasons and from the experts. So I think we have differing testimony and differing views on what the outcome of this discussion should be. But beyond that, you know, Al made a remark before, and what the spirit and intent of the law was through 24A was to expand the utilization of prevailing wage into private sector work when there was, and the law currently says 30%, you know, and all that, these significant subsidies, right? Because it's in one way or another, it's public dollars. Well, not deemed public work, that would be covered under 220. Tax abatements, you know, in our view, is really public dollars. So I think, you know, it's very difficult to, based in the current scenario, just come up with a number, you know, whether it's a number for here in New York City as opposed to the rest of the state. So I think it's I feel it's extremely complicated. The other reality, let's face it, is the composition of the board, right? So you have a composition of the board, and I say this with all due respect, that frankly have competing views and maybe in some cases competing interests, right? Clearly, they're labor representatives or those that are on the board that favor and support the expansion of prevailing wage, like, for example, so a public member like Crystal Lund with his experience at DOL, or Professor Dr. Skinner, who was with us from Cornell, as opposed to some of the real estate groups or ABC or AGC, you know. So I think we're never going to get consensus from this board. And if it's just going to be like a weighted gain here that, you know, well, how many votes are in the room that day? You know, I think this whole system right now is far from perfect. And I don't know, you know, a decision is going to either disappoint or inflame one half of the board or vice versa. So I think, you know, you have to really go back, look at all of the testimony from the experts, and use your best judgment somewhere in the future based on all the testimony. Because, I mean, I don't think we get to a point from the board that we all say, yes, it should be, you know, 2.5% discount on, you know, abatements. I just don't think we get there. So that's just my thoughts. This is a very complicated issue, as I said. But I think the reality of the way you're asking the board to come to a consensus, I don't believe that's feasible. So, you know, that's just my thoughts.
So Gary, what are you saying that you would like to have happen?
Well, frankly, Hope, I think that the way the current construct of the law itself is, it's far too ambiguous. And I think we should revisit the law, to be honest with you. I think there's just too much ambiguity. And I think everyone that looks at it, I mean, Jim and I discussed this at length for months about sections of the law that we still haven't even really come to an agreement on. What is construction cost?
Definitions.
Definitions.
Right.
So I think we're in a situation where it's practically impossible for us to come around and get a consensus because the law itself is so ambiguous, which, you know, we were involved, Jim and I were involved in the negotiations, right? You know, this was somewhat by design, to be honest with you, Hope. And we know, look, we're all been around the political world for a long time. This board, you know, and again, not taking anything away from the board, but, you know, this was a kick the can type thing. And like, okay, we're going to come up with these numbers and then you're going to create this board and let them figure it out. The problem is the way the law was actually finalized and adopted into statute. There are so many open and ambiguous issues. It's virtually, in my view, Hope, almost virtually impossible for us to come to consensus because in some cases of our, maybe I should, you know, either our institutional or ideological views and beliefs on how the law should be implemented. So that's really all I'm saying is to me, the problem is the law itself. It's too ambiguous. And still, we haven't even really made consensus after all these years on certain definitions. I mean, I think we could all agree on that. And it's not like we're fighting about it. We're just saying, what does that mean? Well, we think it means, construction cost is this. No, we don't think that. We think, furniture and fixtures and things that should be included in the, I mean, it's just one issue after the other because the law is, no law is perfect, but this law is overly ambiguous, I think. That's my thoughts. I'm just looking at it very practically, and I don't think anybody could disagree with the fact that we all feel the law is very difficult to interpret the law. And that's why we all have our different interpretations, right? That's all.
Is there a possibility that there could be consensus where it pertains to decisions that have been made, by the IDA boards themselves, which we've learned that many of the IDAs do use the net present value and establish their own discount rate. And let the IDA boards themselves make that determination, but so that you can prevent, a board from doing something to avoid prevailing wage, put a cap on what that might be, using, for example, the discount rates that were suggested by Mike as a cap, but leaving it to the IDAs, which have been using, some use them, some don't. I mean, I'm not happy about the fact that they don't, but they don't.
Right.
I can't. If they don't, there's not much we can do about it. But if they do, and I know a couple that don't use them, and that's problematic for me. But I think they would be, they're also a factor in this. We make the determination, or the legislators will make the ultimate determination. But the IDAs also do have a strong voice in what we're doing here, and I would certainly want to give them some deference on how we craft this.
Well, look, I would say this, Peter, and thank you for, saying what you said in the way you did to try to figure out a path to consensus. I mean, I don't have the law in front of me. I haven't looked at it in a while. I would like to go back. I think certainly your input and deference to IDAs, obviously is going to take place. I'm just not sure. I mean, we have counsel in there, that IDAs have the authority to determine that. I mean, I don't know if it should come through this process or through the DOL, under this board. I'd have to go back and look, I just, in terms of what the law says about, determining these and the process in which we're going through. That, I mean, I clearly IDAs are going to weigh in, no question about it, and they should weigh in. But I just don't know about, just deferring to each IDA to do things, I mean, what if one IDA says that it's 3%, another says 5%, another one says it's 2%, I don't know. I think whatever we do, I think it needs to be somewhat either minimally regional or uniform in some way. That, that's my thought.
We're at a really interesting point here. And I really appreciate the discussion because we've not been able to have a lot of discussion about what we've heard. We have received a lot of written testimony on both topics, the topic of calculating tax savings and the topic of calculating other funds. As I recall, the conversation about calculating other funds was much simpler. It's the tax savings issue that we're really going to struggle with.
Right.
And we've had the opportunity to question experts on subtopics on the tax savings. And we are now at a point where we need to determine how best to move forward to get the board to a place where we can start formulating potential recommendations based on the information already provided for the body to consider. To Gary's point, we may not be able to get to that final agreement, but right now we have a process where we have to put some proposals on the table so we can begin to look at the what ifs. I would also recommend that between now and the March meeting, you have the opportunity to take some of these suggestions and run some numbers through them and see what the differences are. I don't know how big a difference some of these discounted rates mean. I honestly don't. So that's something else for somebody to think about, because we're kind of in the dark about the actual implications of using any of these suggestions. So I'm going to propose that the board conclude this part of our meeting with the understanding the hearing remains open, because we can't close the hearing until we're ready to go to the next step. And when we meet again in March, we come prepared to present proposals on topics. And you've started making some of those proposals today. So think about, refine those proposals, run some numbers, see what impacts they would have, so we can have a more targeted conversation. Because we still have a whole bucket of testimony that we're really trying to boil down to some things we can really grapple with. Understanding that we may end up where Gary said, that's quite possible. But if we can come in March ready to put those proposals on the table, if you run some numbers, bring them, because that would be very helpful to say in the real world, this is what would happen. And then we can go through that process. If anybody thinks that at that meeting, the hearing's still open, if anybody thinks that there's somebody, you're running numbers and you have somebody who could actually testify for clarity, let us know, because the hearing is still open. They could come in and present that information. But I think we're ready to kind of boil some of this down. The proposals are not the final recommendations. Remember, we put proposals on the table, we debate them. Ultimately, it goes to Sean as the secretary as recommendations. If there are 3 recommendations that are on the table that are very similar, he may combine them into one recommendation. So, you don't have to come with your final, come with your thinking. And then we'll decide in March, do we keep the hearing open for more testimony? Do we close the hearing and send Sean off to put everything together? But that's for March. So that's my recommendation. What say you? I see Jim's hand up and Laura.
I was just going to simply say I support your approach.
Thank you. Lara.
I think that sounds right as well, Commissioner Reardon. I'm a newest, I think, board member, so I just have a couple of questions that kind of help contextualize this conversation today for me. One is, we're talking about, I would imagine, a fairly small percentage of projects where this calculation comes into play. And so I'd like to, and just if somebody could, maybe Commissioner Reardon or Sean, someone could speak to it, just in like the history of the board. How many cases are we struggling to understand whether prevailing wage should be paid or not? Like, how close is the calculation there?
That is a great question. I didn't ask her to ask that. Sean?
Off the top of my head, there's, I think, 20% of the projects we've considered have involved a pilot, I want to say, which is where this is coming into play, the calculating out over time.
And also, how many, I mean, it's my impression that most of the projects that come in, not just to the board, just come into the Bureau, are either clearly over or clearly under, or they're excluded because of an exclusion. So we're not getting every project in New York State. We're only getting a subset, right?
Right. Roughly 30 projects, once it's like 6 of them where there's really been an issue, and not all 6 has it been a deciding factor.
Right. So as we think about what parameters we want to perhaps embrace, remember that these parameters really only apply to a small number of projects. It's not a huge number of projects statewide, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And then my other question is, have folks on the board, or have we had any other experts come in and speak on what the impact of the total project costs are of paying prevailing wage? I mean, in my experience, the labor costs of the total project are going to be quite small, and then the increase of paying prevailing wage turns out to be, a pretty, typically less than 2% of the total project cost, and you would see an increase in paying prevailing wage. And that's assuming, labor costs are somewhere between 20 and 30% of the project. Obviously depends on the project, but I just think that's very relevant, right? If we think about kind of the spirit of the law and how many projects are coming into the space of what's the impact of paying prevailing wage.
Right, and the definition of total construction project costs is looming in front of us. We've not agreed to that definition, but you're right, that the amount of the impact of the labor to the entire project, I think we've had that discussion generally, but we haven't had it specifically. So that's.
And I might add there, I mean, 20%, I think there's a rare project that would be that low on the labor costs, but that does depend on the project, the type of project involved. And I think that we would probably need testimony from actual estimators, construction estimators, I 2%, because there are a number of factors that go into prevailing wage calculations, not the raw wage. And so there's a lot that goes into it, a lot that will go into how an estimator is going to look at it, and how that's going to be approached on a project. I know I've heard that it's not all that significant. If it's not all that significant, this would not be a big deal. And I think that, but depending on the type of project, depending on the location, depending on the type of work that's actually being done in certain segments, there can be, a broad range of financial impact. And, Sean and I have had this discussion, because it's not just about the wage, it's also about the jurisdictional issues. It's about, are we using labor rates or carpenter rates, or are we using ironworker rates for windows? So there are a lot of factors that go into it that make it a very project-specific analysis.
So I would suggest if somebody wants to have expert testimony to that, is that germane to this question, or is that a separate hearing?
I don't know I think that's for the board to determine if that is.
Right.
I don't think the level of impact, I think is relatively,
I mean,
that's for the political discussions as to what
Right.
the impact is or is not, and what the economic impact is of passing the law in the first place. And I think
we're not having that conversation.
No, I think that the one pertinent item that we, once we get past this piece, I think we really need to dive into the total construction project cost.
And that's a separate hearing.
That's a separate.
Yeah, okay. So that would be a separate hearing. Any other questions about my proposal?
I guess my only comment would be like, we're going to determine what is the value of this discount of this,
Do you
value of the
discount? What is the
the
discount?
discount of the subsidy, and it's going to range from 0
Yes.
to 100. Okay?
Yeah.
So we're going to come somewhere between, it's a matter of degrees of what we're talking about. It's in terms of, okay, I just had to wrap my head around that a little bit, because
Yeah.
I'm not sure it should be discounted. So that would be
And that's,
0.
and that's a fair conversation to have.
One of the things that intrigued me about Mr. Denolo's testimony was the idea that a lot of the folks as we're looking at that, they're not looking at the subsidy and the weight of the subsidy, whatever it was, the pilot or whatever, much beyond the 5 years. That first 5 years is a critical piece. And so it becomes negligible to a degree of what's going to make a project go or not go. And that's always my concern, is that the idea of economic development, the idea of what's going to stop a project from happening, because that is not very interesting for any of us if the project doesn't happen. We're faced as an association with the idea of private projects being built on public land, the lack of lien law coverage there, and legislation. And there are those subcontractors want 100% perform or payment bond or letter of credit. And I'm hearing from developers that will scuttle a project. And so is there some place in between? Now, that'll be a legislative discussion, but I think we've always got to look at the idea of, what's going to knock a project out, because economic development is going to be critical, in a lot of different ways, including tax base for the state of New York and the localities.
We are also dealing with a law that deals with public wages. So it's not, we are also being concerned about how public wages are applied, and that's the law that we're following. So right now, I want you to, if everybody's in agreement, we'll come back in March with some proposals, some sharpened thinking, talk to other experts if you want, consult with your people you consult with. If you've run numbers, please bring them in. I think to Laura's point, it always strikes me that the number of projects that really come for consideration here is very small. It's not every project. And so, remember that we are talking about a subset of all economic development in the state. And we're just making sure that when public monies are used to a certain level in these projects, that the public wages apply. That's our consideration. So I don't know that we need to take a vote. I think that's my recommendation. I don't see anybody saying no. At this point, is there any other public business that the members would like to discuss before we go into executive session? Okay. During the next portion of our agenda, the board will be discussing specific projects that the board members received prior to today. I would like to remind the board that when we do not have quorum, we cannot officially vote, which delays projects. It's our responsibility as members of this board to be prepared for these predetermined dates. Since we have quorum today and consistent with the board's procedure and the confidentiality requirements set forth in Labor Law Section 224C5, I move that the board enters executive session. Do I have a second?
Second.
Without objection? Excellent. So we will go into executive session. We will now be ending the live stream and closing the doors to the public to enter the executive session. When the executive session has been adjourned, we will reopen the meeting room to the public.
This is now an open session virtually.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome back any members of the public who are attending today's meeting. 2 projects were presented to the board in executive session, and determinations were issued by the board for 1 project. The second project was referred back to the Bureau of Public Work and Prevailing Wage Enforcement for further information. The determinations and the reason for which projects, if any, were exempt from coverage will be published on the Department of Labor's website, consistent with Labor Law Section 224C5. Again, our next quarterly meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, March 19th at 11 a.m. Please keep in mind that there may also be additional meetings determined as necessary. All dates for 2025 have been set and are available online. We have now concluded discussing today's agenda items. Materials, including reporting of today's meeting, will be posted on the boards and committees section of the Department of Labor's website. As we've reached the conclusion of today's meeting, I move that we adjourn. Do I have a second?
Move.
Thank you very, very much. This concludes our meeting today. I want to thank the members of the board for being here and for your service to the people of New York and for your dedication to our issues. Thank you all. Have a happy and safe holiday. And I get to say, see you next year.
Thank you.